Hi and welcome. Short notice before we get started. This video is part of a comprehensive GitHub Actions course that I have available on Udemy. The link with the big discount is in the description of this video. And if you don't want to miss any upcoming videos or courses that I publish, make sure to subscribe to the channel and follow the videos. Let's now discuss the fundamental building blocks of GitHub Actions. There are 3 building blocks, and these are workflows, jobs, and within jobs we have steps. Let's now go through each one in detail and understand the differences. Workflows are defined at the repository level. That means whenever we want to create a workflow, we have to create within a repository. They also define which triggers actually start the workflow. This is not done at the job nor at the step level, but rather at the workflow level. And workflows are composed of one or more jobs. Okay, we can have one job, but we can also have multiple jobs per workflow. Jobs are then defined at the workflow level. We cannot create jobs outside of workflows. And they also define in which execution environment they are run. This can be Linux, Windows, or Mac. We will explore the differences and the possibilities in a later lecture. And they are composed of one or more steps. And by default, jobs are run in parallel. That means if you create 10 jobs and you do not specify any dependencies between these jobs, they will all start at the same time whenever the workflow is triggered. Last but not least, steps are defined at the job level, and they define the actual script or GitHub action that will be executed once that step is then run. By default, the steps run sequentially, and actually the by default here is superfluous because steps will always run sequentially. If we want to make steps run in parallel, we would have to define them in different jobs and then make these jobs actually run in parallel. One small note regarding the GitHub Action term here. If you are new to GitHub Actions, then there's probably a little bit of confusion between what GitHub Actions mean and workflows and GitHub Action here at the bottom. Let's try to simplify this to understand a little bit what the different terms mean. So I like to think that GitHub Actions at the top here, whenever we say GitHub Actions, we are talking about the feature as offered by GitHub, the whole thing. The workflows, the custom actions that we will use, and many other features that are offered by GitHub as part of this GitHub Actions. So when I hear GitHub Actions, I really think the whole thing. Basically, okay, I know that this is a CI/CD solution that is provided by GitHub. This is what I equate the GitHub Actions term here to. Now, workflows, we already discussed. This is actually where we define everything that will happen as part of our CI/CD pipeline. So nothing happens outside of workflows. We need workflows, which are then run in this feature, in this solution that is offered by GitHub. And then finally, we have at the bottom here a GitHub action. A GitHub action is, as I understand it, a piece of code that we can run as part of a job, as one of its steps, but that we take it from somewhere else. We take it from another repository, we take it from the GitHub Actions marketplace, and we simply reference it in one of our steps. Instead of passing a certain shell command, we actually pass a GitHub action here, and we will see that as well in later lectures. And this is basically a piece of custom code that offers a certain functionality that we want to run. We want to integrate into our jobs in our workflow. If the concepts are still a little bit confusing, don't worry about it. As we work with these different parts, we will then get more clarity around them. But if as you progress as well, there are some doubts and some aspects which are not clear, then make sure to ask questions. I'm more than happy to clarify anything that is not clear for you. Last but not least, let's see how the elements here on the right really correspond to the different concepts that we have seen of workflows, jobs, and steps. So workflows here are basically the whole thing, right? This whole file here, and this is a valid workflow. If you were just to copy and paste this and push to your repository, this will run. There are a few things that we need to keep in mind, and we'll discuss that in the next lecture when we have the first practical exercise. But if you were to copy this and simply push to GitHub, that would work. Okay, so at the workflow level, we define the workflow name, and here we define the trigger. In the later lecture, again, we will talk about different types of triggers and how we can work with them. And then under the jobs key, we define our jobs. This is one job and this is another job, right? And then within the job here, we specify where the job runs. This is going to run in the same environment. It doesn't mean that they will share the same virtual machine. Okay, this is not true. Jobs run in independent virtual machines. It just happens here that they will both run in Ubuntu machines, but this does not mean that they will share anything between them. Okay, very important to highlight that. And then under the steps key here, we will define an array of steps to run in our workflow. Now, this is just the basic explanation, the basic details here, or the basic structure. And as we progress through the course, you will also come across many other things that we can do here. But hopefully with this, we can actually get a good understanding of the matching between our YAML file, where our workflow is defined, and the concepts that we have discussed here at the beginning of this lecture. Our goal for this first practical exercise is to create a simple yet fully functional GitHub workflow so that we can understand the main concepts we have discussed in the previous lecture. Let's start by creating our workflow file. And in GitHub Actions, for us to create a workflow file, this should be created within a specific folder in our repository. So I'm going to make a directory here. And this is the .github directory. And then within this .github directory, we also will make another directory, which is going to be called workflows. And this has to be, this specific structure is required so that we can create our workflows here, and they are then identified by GitHub Actions and they're properly handled by it. Within this workflows folder, we can now create our first file, and we'll simply call this 01-building-blocks. And then the extension here is going to be YAML. So every workflow that we create in GitHub is a YAML file. And as soon as I open this, you see that we have an error here, a small squiggly line, and it's simply giving us some cryptic error message. This is because I have the GitHub Actions extension installed. Let me show you how to do that. And here, if you were to search for extensions, I have more extensions here because I do other things in Visual Studio Code. But if you were to simply look for GitHub Actions, then the first one that is going to appear here is from GitHub itself. If you open this, you will see there are quite a few downloads, and it's provided by github.com. And you can then, in your case, if you do not have it installed, you can just click on install here. And this provides lots of additional functionalities, including the validation of our files, right? So here, if we were to open our building blocks again, we see that there is some error message. It's identifying that this is a workflow file from GitHub Actions and it is not valid. Let's then start by adding the first key here, and it's going to be the name of the workflow. The name of the workflow is simply called 01-building blocks. Now we see there's still an error. There are a few missing properties here. As you can see, it already identifies that there are two properties that we need to provide. The first one is the on property, and this identifies the trigger of the workflow. And the second one is the jobs property. As we have already seen in the previous lecture, this defines which jobs are composed or are included in our workflow. For us to begin with, let's add on here push. And then this simply tells GitHub Actions that whenever we push to the remote repository, we would like to execute this workflow. And then under the jobs key, we're going to define a couple of jobs. The first one is going to be echo-hello. And then we will define where this job runs. We will say runs-on, and this is going to be Ubuntu latest. And for pretty much every workflow here, except when we discuss different runners, we're going to use Ubuntu, we're going to use Linux, because this is the option that is the cheapest in GitHub Actions. And it also is the option that we'll normally see that is used in most workflows out there. If there are any specific features that are required that require a Windows or a macOS runner, then feel free to change that. But for all our purposes here, Linux runners are more than enough. Then within the, still under here, the echo-hello, we will add another key. This is a steps key. And as we have also discussed, this will define all the steps that are run by our job within our workflows. The first one we're going to add with a name, and this is going to be called simply say hello. And then you can see here that there is something missing. If we hover over, then it simply says that we need to add one of these properties. Okay, so now here for us, we can simply add the run property, and this is going to run a bash script in this step. We'll simply say run echo hello world. And once we save this, I'm going to save this so that it auto formats for me. It's important that you observe the indentation here. It's very important that under the jobs, we have 2 spaces or 4 spaces. That's also fine. So this would, for example, be a valid file if we have like so, right? For example, this is valid, and here this is also valid. So the important thing is that the indentation is the same for keys that belong to the same object. In YAML here, basically jobs defines a key, and the value of this key is this object. And this is an object containing one key, and then again another object here. And this object of hello world contains 2 keys, the runs on and the steps. And then the steps here is an array. And it's just important that we observe indentation because this is essential in YAML. Whether you use 2 or 4 spaces, it doesn't really matter in the end. I like to use 2 spaces because it makes things look a little bit more condensed, but that's just a personal preference. Now let's define the second job here. We want to define an echo-goodbye. And this echo goodbye is going to have a specific or a small difference here regarding the steps. We're going to see that in a bit. So this will run in Ubuntu latest. And the steps are going to be as follows. The first step is going to have a name of failed step, and it's going to run a code that is going to actually exit with a non-zero code. In Bash, this means whenever you exit with a non-zero code, it simply means that that execution, that script that ran failed. There was something that went wrong. We can simulate that by simply having an exit1, like so, and this is going to simply run and execute the exit command, and then it's going to provide a non-zero code. Now we can also add something here and say echo I will fail, and then after we print this on the screen, we're going to exit with a non-zero code. Why are we doing that? Because I want to show you what happens afterwards. We will have an additional step here, and this is going to be a step of say goodbye. And we will simply say run echo goodbye, like so. Now, what is going to happen here is that as GitHub Actions executes this first step, it's going to run into a step that fails, that doesn't complete its execution successfully. Now, by default, in GitHub Actions, whenever a step fails, then this whole job here is considered as failed, and actually the whole workflow will be considered as failed. But more importantly, if a single step fails here, then any subsequent steps will not be executed by default. We will leave it like this here. This will be our entire workflow. It's a relatively simple workflow. It has 2 jobs. The first one is called echo hello, and the second one is called echo goodbye. And then these jobs simply execute some very straightforward bash scripts. Another very cool thing of having the GitHub Actions extension installed here is you probably already saw that whenever I stop over some part of this workflow file, it gives us a couple of lines of documentation. This is very useful because, for example, if we want to see what the on keyword does, then it really explains everything here. And then we can follow some of the links to see, for example, what are the different triggers that we can use for our workflow. Or for example, we have some more information about defining jobs or about the runners. And you can see here that there are a lot of information. Maybe a lot of things here are not clear because we haven't talked about them. We'll talk about most of these as we progress through the lectures. I just want to show you how you can use this extension to actually clarify some of the concepts if they are not clear for you. For now, let's leave it as it is. We're going to save this file, and then in our terminal, we will add everything. And then we will commit this with any commit message that you would like to. For me, and then for you afterwards to browse the commits more easily, I just want to make it clear that this relates to the building blocks section of the course and that we have added the workflow file. So whenever you browse the commits of this repository later on, then you know what this refers to. Once we do that, we can then push our changes to the remote repository so that we can see them in action in GitHub. Once we come to the GitHub page, then you will see that there will be a small here yellow circle. As soon as you push the repository, it has already turned red to me because we have a workflow that is failing. So if we were to open here and then open the building blocks file, then we have an exit code of 1 here at the bottom. So this fails. It is intended. But as you can see, we didn't have this before. Before pushing this, we didn't have this indicator here, and this refers to the actions that get triggered once we execute a certain push to the repository. If we were to then click on the Actions tab on the top, and then we have this run here, and then we click here, then we will see that the echo hello step has executed, or rather the echo hello job has executed successfully. We have the hello world here, and that the echo goodbye job has failed. And here we will say has failed, quote unquote, successfully, because that's the intention. And very important here, as you can see, the say goodbye step did not execute. So this icon here means that this has been skipped and there are no logs here, meaning nothing was printed to the screen. This is very important for us to know how it works, because if there are any steps that fail in our workflows, we would like to know which other steps are going to be executed or not. Once we talk about controlling the execution flow in workflows, we're going to dig deeper into these relationships regarding failed, not failed, canceled, successful, or whenever we want to, for example, run a step always. For example, this complete job here has been executed despite the failed step here exiting with a non-zero code. Now, how does that happen? Well, we will discuss that also later on in the lectures when we talk about controlling the execution flow in our workflow files. To summarize what we did in this first practical exercise, let's go through our workflow file again and see what happened actually in GitHub Actions. So the first thing, we have this name here, and the name of 01 building blocks appears in our Actions tab here whenever we click on all the workflows. So this is exactly matching this name here. This might appear on the left as well if it's a bigger window, but it might also appear at the bottom if it's a smaller window, or if you put it a little bit minimized here on the side. Now, this workflow then happens every time we push to the repository for all the branches. It doesn't really matter, doesn't do any filtering based on the branches. And then each workflow run is gonna appear here. For us to understand that, let's go back to our IDE. And now, instead of having a failed step, let's have a successful step. Successful step, and we'll say I will succeed. And we will exit with a code of 0. Now we're going to save this, we're going to add all the files, and then we'll simply say git add commit and your commit message as you want to. Once we do that, we can then push the changes to our remote repository and go back to GitHub. Back here in GitHub, you can see that our new commit has already triggered a new workflow run. This workflow is queued, meaning it is waiting for a runner to become available. Then it goes to in progress, and very soon this workflow should be a successful workflow. After 12 seconds of execution, then we can see that the execution is actually green. And if we were to enter here, we will see that both the steps executed successfully. Now the successful step executed, it has exited with a code of 0. And then because it was successful, then the say goodbye step was also executed. That's it for this first practical exercise. Let's now take a short break and come back in the next lecture.